Location, the lab. Quentin only has 24 hours to sell his car. Is that even possible? He goes to Carvana.com.
What is this, a movie trailer?
He ignores the doubters, enters his license plate. Wow, that's a great offer. The car is sold, but will Carvana pick it up in time for...
They'll literally pick it up tomorrow morning. Done with the dramatics?
Car selling in record time.
Save your time. Go to Carvana.com and sell your car today. Pickup fees may apply.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. A quick note before we begin. It's been explained to me that Vietnamese names are written last name, middle name, first name, and further, that the proper way to address them in a journalistic context is by their first name. Thus, Pham Xuan An will be referred to as on second and subsequent reference. Also, I did try on pronunciation, but I still have to ask for grace. On the last 2 days in April 1975, when Americans were hastily making their way to the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon to be hauled by gunships to waiting carriers in the South China Sea, a dozen or more friends implored Pham Xuan An to get in. An worked for Time magazine as a war correspondent. He'd done fabulous work, first as a stringer, then as a full-fledged reporter for the venerable weekly publication that had been ahead on many of the stories of the previous decade coming out of the region. He had, in fact, established himself as the unofficial dean of the press corps there, as many who reported from Vietnam depended on An to tell them how the Vietnamese thought, how they lived, how they waged war, and how they viewed the American intrusion into their homeland. How this was not the Vietnam War to them, but, then and now, to be referred to as the American War, the one where the Americans tried to tell them how to run their own country. But An was not just an interpreter of words and customs. He was the guy who knew everyone and heard everything. His one-time boss, Bureau Chief John Larson, said, quote, "He was our information broker," end quote. Most of what An had learned about being a journalist had come from his time in the United States, where he read and revered the correspondence Bible, Joseph and Stuart Alsop's The Reporter's Trade. He adopted the Alsop's rule of the feet, that is, quote, "If you get out and see what's going on yourself and talk to a great many people who are responsibly involved in what is going on, one can hardly help doing a good job of reporting," end quote. It's said that during his tenure working for American newspapers during the Vietnam War, An visited 5 places in Saigon every morning before he showed up to lunch at the Gavral coffee shop to hear more. The Gavral Cafe was well placed. It was across the street from the Continental Palace Hotel, where most foreigners had rooms. The little coffee shop was where journalists and government types both gathered to chat up rumors and run down leads and test the waters of their analysis. An's afternoons then saw him attending official meetings, hearings, or press conferences before he would swing back to the Gavral for a late afternoon coffee. Then he'd file a story. He was, also per the Alsop brothers, a specific kind of war correspondent, the kind that didn't cover the battles so much as he covered what the journalism gurus termed this extreme fluidity of every nation's strategic situation. That's just plain harder to do, and it required smarts, insider info, and all manner of understanding as to who was in command and how they thought and how they had behaved in the past and how they viewed their own futures. An knew the game and he understood the stakes. As one of his future biographers, Larry Berman, explained, An loved his native country more than life itself. But he also deeply loved America and Americans because he had lived there for two of the most peaceful and idyllic years of his life. But on that hectic April day in 1975, the last of the 3 million American military personnel who had served in that war, and every South Vietnamese loyalist, wanted out. The communists were coming hard and fast. You could hear them in the distance, see that they had tanks and rocket launchers, and they were not stopping to let you calmly call a cab. From a CBS News report at the time,
the crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope.
On that day, An risked his life to get the Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans on the last helicopters out. He had already sent his family ahead to the U.S. He had wanted to be evacuated with all the others. There was work to be done in D.C., but his bosses had said no, he had to stay. Not his Time magazine bosses, mind you, his other bosses. Pham Xuan An had been a spy for the communist North Vietnamese since 1957. He'd been educated in California at the party's urging as a hedge against the likelihood that America would take over where France was leaving off. He had already earned 4 North Vietnamese Liberation Exploit Medals for the astute, clandestine reporting back to them about American war strategy, American and South Vietnamese troop strength, and the enemy's likely next moves. He'd also received 6 Soldier of Emulation medals, as well as the most highly esteemed designation of People's Army Hero. Much later, he would be made a Major General in the Vietnam People's Army. As of that day in 1975, he was responsible, despite his unwillingness to acknowledge it, for thousands of enemy deaths. Read that, American deaths. Those names so sharply etched into the wall in Washington, where families still go to weep and strangers go to pay respects to the fallen who went in their name. An had done all that while reporting for Time, smoking and drinking while patiently explaining things to his good friends Robert Chaplin at The New Yorker, David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan of The New York Times, Morley Safer of CBS News, Stanley Karnow of The Washington Post, among others. He did it while maintaining his place on the official American correspondence list, which gave him entree into every critical press briefing done by the U.S. military and the CIA, the only Vietnamese to be accorded that distinction, according to the New York Times. He was allowed as well to attend off-the-record American military briefings, thus giving him extraordinary access and keeping him very cozy with men who ran the world he lived in. Where did he go to keep his family safe now that the war was ending? Who did he trust? Who trusted him? Historian Larry Berman.
In Vietnamese, the name An, it's Pham Xuan An, means hidden. Like his name, his life remains a mystery. In the wilderness of mirrors we often use to describe the world of intelligence gathering.
And Leslie, An must have wondered why he was still alive when almost every other North Vietnamese spy who had operated in this war was already dead. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Cornbread. Hey, partner Scott, describe what you consider an ideal weekend night.
Oh, that's easy. Take a cornbread hemp gummy, climb into bed, and watch something stupid on TV.
That's it right there. That's the life. I barely drink even socially anymore because when I need to unwind, this is my go-to.
Yep, cornbread hemp's CBD gummies are made to help you feel better, whether you're stressed or feeling some discomfort or just needing a little relaxation. They only use the best part of the hemp plant, the flower, for the purest, most potent CBD.
All products are third-party lab tested and USDA organic to ensure safety and purity.
Right now, Crimes of the Centuries listeners can save 30% on their first order. Just head to cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC at checkout. That's cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC.
This admittedly isn't a typical crime story. I mean, we've done spy tales before, but usually of the Americans turning on America variety. Is it really a crime for a guy to spy for his own country? Isn't that, patriotism writ large? We'd think so if it was one of ours, right? And An saw it that way. He would tell one of his biographers that all he wanted was the intruders out of his country. Wasn't that what the Americans had wanted done to the English in 1776? Yeah, I get that. But it's impossible for me to say that the deaths of 58,220 U.S. service members at the cost of over 150 billion American taxpayer dollars wasn't a crime that someone should own up to. Some of you may be thinking you could point the blame finger at a few presidents, a whole wad of politicians, the American military, the other side, arrogance, and last-ditch colonialism as being at fault here. So, too, you could blame this stated desire to stop communism in its tracks before things got really out of hand. That last bit is what Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon repeatedly told the American people as their investment of blood and treasure mounted during the mid-20th century. But today, I'm going to include Pham Xuan An's actions as criminal. I mean, maybe he wasn't an inherently bad man, but he represents how complicated war is. That a decent man and an excellent journalist could justify what he was doing, knowing that people were dying. Telling one army when and where another army was going to be, more or less assuring the first had an unfair advantage over the second. And because if we had out and out won that war, the small man with the wire-rimmed glasses and witty repartee would have been hanged as a spy. Granted, An never fired a shot. Know that the deaths were a burden he never admitted to, basically saying, when asked about that war means dying, and he hadn't made the war. Personally, he would say he loathed communism, but he signed up to be a party member in 1944 when he was 16, along with most of his classmates who pledged themselves to this nationalistic cause. In truth, he said, he believed that the communist-backed rebels, the Viet Minh, later they'd be called the Viet Cong, were the only people who could get the French out of Vietnam, and he was all in on that. Larry Berman, the author of Perfect Spy, The Incredible Double Life of Pham Xuan An, took a very forgiving pen to An's story. He wrote that An had, quote, a vision for Vietnamese independence and social justice. He fought for liberty and against poverty. As a spy, he sought neither glory nor money for himself, but everything for the people of his homeland. He did not like being a spy. It was his natural obligation, and while he took it seriously, there was little joy derived from this type of work, end quote. An was born on September 12, 1927, in Bien Hoa Psychiatric Hospital, the only hospital in Vietnam not run by French occupiers. It was the only hospital open to the Vietnamese within a 20-mile radius. His family wasn't poor. An's great-grandfather was a silver and goldsmith who made medals for the royal court. His grandfather was a high-ranking government official. His father was an engineer, Berman said.
His job was to travel around throughout southern Vietnam and do surveys, and he took young An with him. And one of the things An learned was how poor the country was and how lucky, as his father always told him, how lucky he was not to be that poor and to have a way to survive. Colonialism had robbed them of so much.
An was taught a little English by missionaries during World War II when Japan occupied his country. By late 1945, he had already left school and was a jungle fighter against first the Japanese, then the newly ensconced French. Soon, though, the rebels saw his affability as an asset, putting him in their first batch of intelligence trainees. His assignment was to make himself available to newcomers, first the French, then the Americans, as someone who could assist in their understanding of Vietnamese culture. He made his party status a formal declaration in 1953 in a jungle ceremony. It was presided over by Lee Duc Tho. If that name rings a vague bell, he was the guy who would later spend 4 years secretly negotiating for peace with U.S. Secretary of State Harry Kissinger. An always did have a way of crossing paths with the famous, or soon-to-be, a kind of Vietnamese Forrest Gump. An practiced his English by volunteering as a press censor. That expanded to An being recruited into translation work, as well as work with clandestine services that were spending money and shipping supplies to counter the work of the Viet Minh. This way, An met those who would later form the core of the Central Intelligence Agency operating out of Vietnam, and who would, from their earliest meeting, trust him implicitly, even after he had been unmasked. But I'm ahead of myself. Let's get back to An, who found himself assigned by Hanoi to get himself to the United States to learn about how we think. He had never been. He was already 30. Burman again.
An's job would be to go study the American temperament, and his mission was to stay 6 years. And he was to learn everything about the Americans because the Viet Minh had determined that it was only a matter of time. This is 1957, right? 57. It's only a matter of time before the Americans will come. And the Americans will come with military, and we don't know who they are. We need to understand them.
Because of his charm and his dutiful work on their behalf, many influential Americans took up his cause when he voiced a desire to learn journalism in the U.S. They wrangled a hard-to-get and red tape-ensnared visa and found him a welcome environment at a small community college in Costa Mesa, California. Orange Coast College was a relatively new center of post-high school education, mostly frequented by commuters, housed in buildings which had previously been used as a military base. It wasn't Harvard, but it gave An a close-up view of a working-class, straight-shooting part of a country he could never have imagined. Once there, An figured the only way to not be suspected of anything nefarious was to be outgoing and friendly and visible. Suffice to say, it worked. Ross Johnson, his dorm mate, a virulent anti-communist jock who later became a staunchly Republican state senator, was good friends with An and even later stood by him. An took a variety of classes, learned AP style, went to school dances, and learned it was okay to hold a girl's hand. He wrote frivolous features in the school paper. He went with his new friends to their scattered homes over the school holidays, enjoying the graciousness of Thanksgiving feasts and sharing Christmas bounty, enchanting everyone in sight. He even learned to sail in the same Newport Beach harbor where the most iconic of Americans, John Wayne, lived. An fell in love with Southern California, which isn't hard, and with America, which wasn't that hard either. He also managed, in his second year, to fall in love with the female editor of the Barnacle, the student newspaper. Lee Meyer was blonde, slim, and bespectacled, and smart enough to promote An to second-page editor, whatever that was. They were, as Berman wrote, inseparable. Though their romantic relationship was not to last, they kept in touch for most of their lives. A good student, An became part of the Foreign Student Club and was even asked to run for student body vice president on a ticket backed by the anti-communist ranks of Korean War veterans. Weird times for the young spy. Back in his own country, life was becoming increasingly hard for those with communist sympathies. In the midst of his first year at OCC, An's brother was captured. Then An lost contact with his handlers in Hanoi and feared that his name was on some list that would soon be public and he would never be able to return home. He even told Berman that he began to take Spanish courses in case he needed to escape through or hide in Mexico or South America to escape their wrath. When he left OCC after his second year, he interned as a reporter for the Sacramento Bee, where his first assignment was to cover the county fair. While there, he made a lifelong friend of Eleanor McClatchy, the daughter of the publisher. By the by, the McClatchy family would go on to build a newspaper empire that still exists today. It currently owns the Miami Herald, the Charlotte Observer, the Kansas City Star, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, as well as the Sacramento, Fresno, and Modesto Bees. Eleanor, obviously smitten by An, asked him to come along when a Russian delegation landed in Sacramento to meet the governor. His time at the Bee was the only time in his life, he would later say, when he wasn't anxious or scared. Biographer Berman tells an interesting story about An's time while in California, illustrative of his character. Seems he was taking a bus from Monterey back to Costa Mesa one night and, having fallen asleep, missed his stop. When he awoke, he had no choice but to spend the night in a cold bus terminal without food or money. Overhearing his dilemma, a young woman called a family friend to see if he could offer to drive An back. The friend agreed, and while driving, An learned that the man had a son in the Air Force stationed at U.S. military headquarters in Saigon. The Good Samaritan wanted An to look him up when he returned to his country. They should meet, the man said. An never told his handlers about the offer and never looked up the man's son. He knew he could have used the information he could glean from his visit to his advantage, but believed that that would be exploiting a kindness, something he said he was unwilling to do. Americans, as far as he was concerned, were the accidental enemy. There was no need to make it any uglier than it already was. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Storyworth. I am so excited to have Storyworth back.
Back? This is new to me.
New to you, yes, but not to me. Storyworth was a sponsor a few years ago, and through them, I made the coolest book with my dad, and now we're going to do it with your mom for Mother's Day.
Oh, really? Tell me about it.
Okay, so Storyworth emails your loved one a memory-provoking question that you get to help pick. Questions like, did you ever get in trouble in school? Or how did you decide how many children to have? All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story.
Sounds fun.
It really is. You'll be emailed a copy of your loved one's responses as they're submitted over the course of the year. And after that year of fun and getting to know your mom even better than you already do, Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit for generations to come. I really do. I love the book I did with my dad. I made copies for my sisters and my kiddo.
Aw.
Give all the moms in your life a unique, heartfelt gift you'll cherish for years. Storyworth. Right now, save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/COTC.
That's storyworth.com/COTC?
Yep, storyworth.com/COTC to save $10 on your first purchase. After Pham Xuan An finished his stint at the Sacramento Bee, he traveled around the country, returning to Saigon in late 1959, fearful that his cover might be blown. He wasn't being paranoid. Many spy networks had been discovered, their agents arrested. If he was compromised too, he could be imprisoned, tortured, even killed. He could have opted to lay low and wait things out, but that wasn't his style.
His solution showed his psychological genius.
This is from a documentary called Perfect Spy.
He wrote directly to the head of Southern counterintelligence, who had a list of all Northern spies. I just finished journalism school in America and need work. Can you help? If declined, his cover was blown. If accepted, the perfect shield. The intelligence chief not only hired him, but introduced him to President Diem's palace. Later, he joined Vietnam's official press agency.
Soon he became a part-time correspondent for the Associated Press and then got better work at Reuters. always listening for anything helpful. He was, of course, working for the Viet Minh at the same time, designated as Agent X6. Operating essentially alone, An's work expanded as he regularly wrote reports, sometimes using invisible ink, making mail drops to a crew of agents whose job was to protect him. He was very good at what he did, fooling everyone who counted. Well, almost everyone. The only journalist who was sure that An was a spy for the Viet Cong was a New Zealander named Nick Turner, who worked for Reuters, twice as bureau chief during the war years. According to James Pringle, writing in The Baron in 2018, Turner would not be dissuaded from his suspicions. He fired An. Pringle, who worked for Reuters at the time, wrote, quote, "Many people thought An was just very well informed, as I did," end quote. While no one seemed sure of where they had heard it, his journalism bud somehow came to the belief that An was an American-educated son of a wealthy and conservative Vietnamese family, that he'd grown up in the well-to-do Mekong Delta, and his family had lost all their land and their possessions to the communists. An did nothing to change the perception. While working, An would disappear for days at a time. Reporting can be like that, especially during a war when it makes sense to go into the field occasionally and see for yourself what's going on. But of course, An was not reporting on the battlefront. He was reporting on what the Americans had told him. He spent his evenings photographing documents or writing reports of what he knew, analyzing what it meant. He then loaded those papers into tin canisters that were hidden in rotting fish or in grilled street food wrapped in rice paper. He would run into people who had just dropped something, offering to help them pick it up, depositing his work into their baskets. Or he'd put his goods into empty bird nests high in trees. Or he'd put them in baskets and leave them at Buddhist funerals to be retrieved in short order. He might also be debriefed by other agents who had come to Saigon to seek him out, or they would travel a few miles outside of the city into the hobo woods to retrieve what he had left them. Then, as explained by biographer Thomas Bass, couriers would run it out the Kachin tunnel network that was the communist underground HQ. Then his intel would be rushed across the Cambodian border, flown to southern China, and then circuitously hustled back to the Politburo in North Vietnam. All the links in the chain were well oiled. His absences were noted, but not addressed. Maybe that's because there were continual rumors that An worked for the CIA, rumors that An did nothing to discourage. There are even stories today that he was, in fact, a double agent, though there's hardly any evidence to support that. What's not disputed is this. He successfully arranged the release of Time reporter Robert Sam Anson, who had been captured in 1970 by the communists in Cambodia. Seems Anson's wife, who brought a young child with her and was pregnant with her second at the time, came to Saigon to look for help in finding her husband. Scared out of her mind, 25 journalists were dead or unaccounted for at the time in Cambodia, she begged An to help her. He did, asking as a personal favor for the Cambodians to let him go. They did. Much later, Anson asked An why he had intervened. "Because," he said, "I was an enemy of your country, but you were my friend." That was all to come. His first job at Time magazine was as a stringer. His work was so thorough and so well-sourced, he was quickly promoted into full-time correspondent work. One of his closest allies was someone he had known from his earliest days learning spy work. That tutelage had been at the hands of the CIA's uber-operative and counterinsurgency legend Edward Lansdale. An had met Lansdale when he had contacted a cousin who An thought could get him out of active duty, fighting for the French in 1954. His cousin was in the psychological warfare department of the Army, and, as these things go with the CIA, Lansdale offered help to the officials there when things were going bad. Lansdale met An through his cousin and found him to be a likable and able guy. Soon enough, Lansdale had himself a personal project, teaching An the art of psychological warfare and the tradecraft most useful to spies. After An had gone to the U.S. to study and then returned to work for time, Lansdale was made director of the Saigon Military Mission, a CIA unit responsible for early paramilitary and sabotage operations there. An eventually was invited to live in the presidential palace as a trusted confidant of the then leader of South Vietnam. An, could call on Lansdale anytime, being buds and all. Lansdale would eventually provide An with more information than he knew what to do with. I want to quote Berman at length right now because it's illuminating. It shows how the web An had weaved, almost from boyhood, worked to his incredible advantage. An told Berman, quote, "I knew Lansdale a long time. He was my friend, and it was natural for us to speak about these things. I told him what I thought, and he shared with me his own assessments. He gave me valuable information. He was always teaching me, and I always listened. I learned so much from Lansdale about counterinsurgency, different ways of fighting the communists." End quote. The conversation that An is referring to is a specific one. After that chat with Lansdale, Berman reports that Hanoi received, courtesy of An, quote, 24 rolls of all plans related to the U.S. Special Wars Strategy, said Muinho, An's direct supervisor at the time. They included the master plan of the war, the materials concerning the building up of armed forces, the support of American troops, the strategic Hamlet plan, the plan of reoccupying liberated zones, and the plan of consolidating the puppet army with American military equipment. End quote. Well, so much for not exploiting your friendships. Now, how did that play out on the battlefield? I'll give you an example. The Viet Cong army was woefully unprepared to fight a war that included state-of-the-art helicopters for air-to-ground assault and 10-ton armored personnel carriers to bring soldiers swiftly to the fight, as well as the kind of tactical thinking common to the American war machine. This is Peter Coyote narrating Ken Burns' The Vietnam War, talking about the Ep8 battle.
But the intelligence underlying it all turned out to be wrong. There were more than 340 Viet Cong, not 120 in the area. Communist spies had tipped them off that they were soon to be attacked. And this time, they would not flee without a fight.
An had given them the information necessary to get prepared just before a major effort by the Americans and the South Vietnamese to seize a radio transmitter in the village of Ep8. The Viet Cong had practiced firing at targets that were the size of the Huey and the Shawnee helicopters and which mimicked their flight capabilities. They practiced hitting things at proper range and proper height by using bamboo poles. When the operation began, the communist-backed Cong were ready, waiting for the choppers to swoop in. When they did, they were met with a skilled barrage that hit 14 of the 15 helicopters deployed that day. 4 helicopters were downed immediately, another later during a rescue attempt. American crewmen died. The Americans learned a lesson that day. The South Vietnamese army was the one that was woefully unprepared, and they had to figure out a new game plan. A captured document later revealed what the Viet Cong thought about that day. It read, quote, "This victory also furnished us with a clear concept on the advantage of the enemy tactics." End quote. They had cracked the code. An did that. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Galatea by Inkit. Between work, errands, and whatever the group chat is spiraling about today, life rarely slows down.
That's the truth.
But you don't need to wait for the perfect moment to arise. Romance is ready when you are. With Galatea, you don't just read, you get swept away in every stolen glance and every heart-pounding touch. You can't stop thinking about. Whatever kind of love story you crave, you'll find it on Galatea.
What are we advertising?
Galatea is a reading app where anyone craving a little me time can dive into a library of romance stories that leave you feeling recharged and fulfilled. They have over 1,000 bestsellers to choose from.
That's a lot of titles.
Galatea is home to original series and standalone stories with an exclusive catalog of best-selling authors with new chapters dropping daily. So there is always something new to explore. Over 30 million people have fallen in love with reading on Galatea. Join now to indulge in stories that make you feel like yourself again.
That'll curb doom scrolling.
Exactly. Right now, Galatea is offering our listeners an extra 25% off on top of an already irresistibly affordable subscription when you go to galatea.com/COTC. That's GALATEA.com/COTC to indulge in unlimited stories for even less. galatea.com/COTC. Thomas Bass wrote in The Spy Who Loved Us, The Vietnam War and Pham Xuan An that An tended to undersell his own usefulness to the enemy. Bass said An rarely claimed to have done more than observe and analyze. He steadfastly maintained he gave the same political analysis to his superiors at time that he gave to North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh. In truth, though, wrote Bass, there were instances where, quote, he reached behind the curtain to adjust the scene, end quote. Also citing the Battle of Ep8, Bass wrote that 2 Viet Cong soldiers received the North Vietnamese Military Exploit Medal for their work that day. The first was the commander of the troops on the ground. The other was An, who, quote, devised the winning strategy, end quote. Bass also pointed out that An helped to plan 1968's Tet Offensive, which had 80,000 Viet Cong troops simultaneously attack targets throughout the entirety of South Vietnam. Berman again.
It was truly a schizophrenic life during the Tet Offensive. He was expected to assist reporters in understanding the enemy offensive. He took Bob Chaplin around Saigon in the same Renault that just the day before he had used to show To Cong all the sites that they should be infiltrating.
By the way, it was called the Tet Offensive because Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a time for celebrations, fireworks, and family gatherings, and the offensive was when they knew a lot of South Vietnamese troops were on leave. For the record, Tet was a disaster for the communists as they lost half their troops in the south and likely a quarter of those stationed in the north. But it somehow marked the end of the average American's patience with the war. Protests began in earnest as college kids marched in the streets yelling, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?"
Johnson had a button nose when first he went to Congress. Now it's long and crooked like a politician's promise. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? We're gonna take your toys away and bring our soldiers home now.
It was all but over now, though the fighting continued for 7 more years. Most spies admit to an almost schizophrenic ability to compartmentalize their lives. An was no exception. Never was that more obvious than in his journalism.
His reports were so detailed that he received the medal, and then in April 1975 he would receive another medal.
Since his unmasking as the super spy he was, it became the elephant in the room. Had An slanted his coverage to favor the communists? Had he spread lies, disinformation? Did he push a certain point of view of the progress of the war to change the American people's view of it? Did he violate every journalistic code and ethic out there? That is, did he purposely write something he knew to be false? He was accused of that by Newsweek correspondent Arnaud de Bourgrave when under oath before a Senate subcommittee that was being chaired by Senator Jeremiah Denton, a Republican from Alabama, a former rear admiral in the Navy and, as a naval aviator, a former prisoner of that war. But if and where that happened is hard to pin down.
So after the war ended, every outfit around, especially accuracy in media, went to see if An, in all of his reporting for Time magazine, had ever provided disinformation, had ever slanted things toward the VC perspective, and they found nothing. Why? Because An's mission was strategic intelligence, and it was much too risky for him to indeed try to create disinformation. Indeed, he bent over backwards to be objective so that he would keep being relied on, because when people want information, they exchange information.
Biographer Bass doesn't think the inquiry into An's written work for American media went far enough. He quotes Frank Snapp, a former CIA interrogator and author of Decent Interval about the fall of Saigon. Quote, "No one has walked the cat backward, done a post-mortem of the damage he did. The agency didn't have the stomach for it." End quote. Snapp told Bass that the CIA loved New Yorker correspondent Robert Shapland and were told to give him, quote, "unbelievable access to embassy and high-level intelligence," end quote. And of course, An was besties with Shapland. The men spent hours together in the Continental Plaza Hotel dissecting what they both had gleaned. Truth is, we will never know how the war would have been different if An had not inserted himself into it in the ways that he did. But there is little debate that what he did mattered to the war's progress and its end.
His intel was so precise that Hanoi's leaders said, "We are inside the American headquarters." Over his career, he sent 498 detailed reports, critical strategic intelligence, countless original documents, game-changing military plans.
An's influence is not to be underestimated. Sometime in 1968, when the Viet Cong decided to shell the shit out of Saigon for no reason and to kill civilians indiscriminately just because they could, An sent back word that told them such butchery had no military purpose, and it was alienating those with whom they would someday have to deal. The shelling stopped. The question of where An's loyalties lay troubled the communist regime after the war was officially over. In August 1978, An was sent to a re-education camp to be reminded of the things he had been fighting for, to help him be done living the life he'd had among his enemies who had been his friends. You know, to teach him how to be a real communist. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Remy. I am a night grinder.
Yeah, you are.
I grind my teeth at night. Something awful. Maybe 20 years ago, a dentist said, "Hey, those headaches you get, that's from grinding at night." And so I got a night guard, which was great. But you know what isn't great, Scott?
Tell me.
How much of a pain it is to go to the dentist to get refitted for those when you need a replacement.
Is that where Remy comes in?
It sure is. If you're part of the 30% of Americans who grind your teeth, there's no better solution to protect your smile than Remy's custom-fit night guard. Here's how it works. You get your impression kit in the mail, delivered straight to your door. Remy gives you step-by-step instructions to get your perfect impression. This is the stage I'm at right now. I'm at the impression stage.
And after that, Remy will ship your custom-fit night guard?
That's right. Made in the U.S. in Las Vegas, in fact. They make it there, and then they send it to you, so you get your night guard and you start protecting your teeth. Remy is so confident you'll get a perfect fit that they offer a 45-night perfect fit guarantee or your money back.
Ooh.
No waiting rooms, no overpriced bills, just a better way to protect your teeth while you sleep. Try Remy risk-free at shopremy.com/COTC and use code COTC to get up to 50% off your night guard at checkout. That's 50% off at shopremi.com/COTC with code COTC.
Thank you, Remy, for sponsoring this episode.
Let's go back for 1 minute to the rooftop of the American Embassy and the safe houses that bordered it. It was chaotic for hours as people climbed over one another to reach the open bay doors of departing helicopters. An did what he could, then went back to his office alone. The North Vietnamese army was literally at his door. He filed 3 more stories. Then, like in a bad movie, the line went dead. When a fellow journalist working for the Far Eastern Economic Review saw him that day, she would later say she remembered his face as being somewhat different than she had expected. After the revelations about An's duplicity, she said she knew at last what his face had signaled: celebration. This is what he had worked so hard for. The Vietnamese were being left to figure out their own destiny by themselves. An typed on. His last byline in time was in May 1976. In 1982, the truth about An's loyalties was revealed. David Halberstam, one of the journalists who worked alongside An, told The New Yorker in 2005 that An's story is, quote, full of intrigue, smoke and mirrors, but I still think fondly of An. I never felt betrayed by An. He had to deal with being Vietnamese at a tragic time in their history where there was nothing but betrayal in the air, end quote. In April of 1997, Robert McFadden wrote in the New York Times that a phalanx of American reporters, some with Pulitzer Prizes for their work on the war and who had shared their lives with An from 1965 to 1975, were on hand at a gathering at the Asia Society on Park Avenue to talk about the legacy of the Vietnam conflict. Some, McFadden noted, did feel betrayed by An and by those who still admired him. Zane Grant, a former U.S. Army intelligence agent and author of Facing the Phoenix, The CIA and the Political Defeat of the United States in Vietnam, wrote that, quote, it was one thing to have been against the Vietnam War, many of us were, but quite another to express unconditional admiration for a man who spent a large part of his life pretending to be a journalist while helping to kill Americans, end quote. An had been invited to attend the 1997 confab, but didn't come. He had been refused an exit visa by the Vietnamese government. Instead, he sent a letter in which he spoke, quote, of the need to help heal the mental and physical wounds of the war, end quote. He asked that his regards be sent to all, especially those who had known him personally during and after the war. He never forgot the value of his American education. He sent his eldest son, Pham Xuan An, to the Minsk State Linguistic University to learn English, then sent him to the U.S. to study political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and on to Duke to get his law degree. The New York Times reported that Huang's expenses while in the U.S. were paid for by his father's former news colleagues. Vietnam and the United States normalized relations in July 1995. When President George W. Bush visited the unified country in July 2006, Pham Xuan An served as translator between Bush and President Nguyen Minh Triet. An died 2 months later. Ironically, maybe, a few years after the Americans made their rapid exit from Saigon, 50,400 South Vietnamese refugees were brought to the United States to be temporarily housed at the Marine Corps base just over the southern edge of the Orange County line at Camp Pendleton. Churches in Orange County quickly moved to sponsor the refugees. According to Tom Berg, reporter for the Orange County Register, more than 18,000 moved into the interior cities of the county within the first 5 years of their lives here because rent was affordable and refugee resettlement agencies were in place to teach the new Americans how to speak the language, apply for jobs, and adjust to their new lives here. Oh, and the weather was good. Soon enough, critical mass meant that the newcomers could find groceries, pharmacies, and insurance from each other, with a specific emphasis on providing things, quote, just like they had back home, end quote. Don Quach, one of the earliest refugees and an ambitious entrepreneur, opened a Vietnamese business center in the Orange County city of Westminster. There, and in nearby Garden Grove, Santa Ana, and Fountain Valley, the Vietnamese community began to coalesce, forming what is now referred to as Little Saigon. It is the largest and oldest Vietnamese community in the United States, with a diaspora numbering close to 200,000, the largest such ethnic grouping to be found outside of Vietnam. Orange Coast College, where An spent most of his 2 years in America, is a stone's throw from the community that exists there now, something that he inadvertently created with his undercover work to oust the intruders he professed all his life that he loved. I'm going to guess that he would have been proud that they found a home where he had found one, that his countrymen could see what he had seen and felt the embrace of not just the people, but the openness that he would later say he'd learned here. When An got to Orange County in 1958, he was the only resident in the whole county who came from Vietnam, a place that no one had heard of and likely couldn't point to on a map if their lives depended on it. Too soon, we would know. But understanding it and how we got involved in its insurrection and how our best intentions unraveled is still a mystery to most of us. Maybe An could have explained it, or maybe even he didn't know. To research this episode, journalist Amy Wilson read Perfect Spy, The Incredible Double Life of Pham Xuan An by Larry Berman and The Spy Who Loved Us, The Vietnam War and Pham Xuan An's Dangerous Game by Thomas Bass. She watched quite a bit of Ken Burns' PBS documentary on the Vietnam War and read coverage of An's death, which was much more well covered than the intricacies of his life. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.